Hello, and welcome to another adventurous and wondrous well episode of the Bible in 1 year with a preacher's husband. Today, we are talking about Psalm 73, 77, and 78. Tomorrow, we're going to be on 1 Chronicles chapter 6. So, as we get started today, in Psalm 73, the first thing we got to do is we can't just read Psalm 73. That's just not a good thing to do. We look at the title and it says, God's Ways Vindicated. And of course, that's in the CSB. So I flip over to, and I pulled out a New King James today. It says, The Tragedy of the Wicked and the Blessedness of Trust in God. So, God's vindication, or the tragedy of the wicked and the blessedness of trust in God. Those are kind of the same thing because God blesses those who trust in Him, and He is vindicated in that way when tragedies happen to the wicked, maybe. Maybe that's what they're trying to say here. But it says a psalm of Asaph. So who is Asaph? To find the answer to this question, we got to go back to Psalm 50. So we're going to flip back to Psalm 50, which is where the first psalm of Asaph was. Now, Asaph was one of David's chief musicians. We're going to read about that in 1 Chronicles 6 tomorrow. Also in chapter 15, 16, and 2 Chronicles 5. He was also the ancestor of a group of temple musicians that we'll read about in Ezra chapter 2. As in the case of Jeduthun, which we'll see in another psalm, the name might have come to represent his descendants or the musicians who followed him rather than Asaph himself. So I found that pretty interesting. And there we are with Psalm 73. I read through that. Be sure to read it. It's a beautiful psalm. We get to Psalm 77 though, and this is where we have a little bit of a connection here. Confidence in a Time of Crisis is the title in the CSB. But in the New King James here, I have Psalm 77 says, The consoling memory of God's redemptive work. Confidence in a time of crisis versus the consoling memory of God's redemptive work. That's very interesting. Now, I took the first 3 verses here, and I'd like to compare them, each one with each different version, and this was phenomenal to me. But first, we're gonna read. This says, according to Jeduthun of Asaph, a psalm. Now, we heard that name just a minute ago, Jeduthun, and to find out about Jeduthun, we have to look back at Psalm 39. Psalm 39 is where that was first listed in the book of Psalms. And Jeduthun is possibly another name for Ethan. Also appears in the titles of Psalms 62 and 77 like we're reading today. According to 1 Chronicles 16, he was one of David's chief musicians. Now this is why it's so important to read those genealogies and who begat who and where these people came from. If this is not a reference to Jeduthun himself, it may refer to his descendants or a group of musicians using his name, perhaps derived from his own musical style or school. I found that pretty interesting. So we get the first verse of Psalm 77. CSB says, I cry aloud to God, and He will hear me. Now flip over to Psalm 77, and the first verse says, I cried out to God with my voice, and He gave ear to me. Now that sounds kind of Shakespearean to me, doesn't it? It's kind of like old Big Willie. That's right, it sounded kind of like Big Willie to me. Maybe wait a minute. I put the lit in literature, baby. Yeah, I think you did. Oh, yeah, I said that about you, Billy Wigglestick. I said it, I did. Oh, no, I didn't. Yes, thou didst. Oh, you disgust me. Indeed, we did, Sir Billy Wigglestick. We disgust thee. Now back to the scripture. Verse 2. I sought the Lord in my day of trouble. My hands were continually lifted up all night long. I refused to be comforted. That's verse 2 of Psalm 77 in the CSB. In the New King James it says, my hand was stretched out in the night without ceasing. My soul refused to be comforted. That's just beautiful. Lifting those hands high in worship to God. Reaching out to Him. Verse 3, I think of God, I groan, I meditate, my spirit becomes weak. And verse 3 of the New King James says, I complained and my spirit was overwhelmed. Wait, I remembered God and was troubled. I complained and my spirit was overwhelmed. Wow. Just wow. This guy is pouring his heart out. Pouring his heart out to God. Amazing. Now we move on to Psalm 78. The title in the CSB is Lessons from Israel's Past. And the title in the New King James Version is God's Kindness to Rebellious Israel. Now, this psalm was just chock full of historical references in this. And I'll just list a few of these. Verses 3 and 4. These verses give the purpose of the psalm. All the oral tradition of God's wonderful works will be rehearsed in each generation. Kind of like William Shakespeare did a play. He rehearsed before they did the play, right? Now, verse 6 and 7, this is reciting Israel's early history to future generations, assures the perpetuation of the account. This would connect generations far removed from the original event to the promises and instructions governing Israel's relationship to God. Now we get to verse 8. The goal here was to educate the children so they did not become another stubborn and rebellious generation like we read about in Exodus chapter 17. We get to verse 13, and this verse describes the crossing of the Red Sea like in Exodus 14. We get to verse 14, and we have cloud and light refers to the pillars of cloud and fire representing the Lord's presence that we read about in Exodus 14 and chapter 40. Verses 15 and 16 of Psalm 78, the split rocks and the stone describe water from the rock at Horeb and Meribah that we read about in Exodus 17 and Numbers 20. And of course, verses 23 through 25 talk about the manna that we read about in Exodus 16. And then verses 26 through 31, when Israel murmured against God and desired meat, the Lord sent a whole bunch of quail, or winged birds, so to speak, in Numbers 11. Verses 44 through 51, these are the plagues. Now these plagues, they were not described in the sequence from Exodus chapter 7 through 11, but they all did happen. All these were legitimate plagues that happened. And I look at it as them putting this in kind of a poetic order versus a chronological order. This is more of a artistic impression. This is a song. This is a psalm. All right? It does include history, but is also, they're taking poetic license, I guess, with it to do it, to list these in the way they listed them. Verse 55, the conquest and settlement of Canaan as recorded in Joshua chapter 6 through 22. And in verse 61 is referring to his strength through captivity. And this is a reference to the capture of the ark by the Philistines in 1 Samuel chapter 4 through 6. I was just fascinated at all the history that was in today's reading. I hope you were too. If this has touched you, of course, click the like button and the subscribe button, and also the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video, which will be tomorrow for 1 Chronicles chapter 6. We'll see you then.